Hi, this is Kate with another video, and I hope everybody's doing well. If you like my content, please subscribe. Helps me build the channel. I'm at 241 subscribers. I thank everyone who subscribed. I see this channel as a form of activism. Part of what the left has to do, part of what we need to do is dissemination of information. People are so indoctrinated, and the mainstream media is just crap. And get the word out, break through the media blockade, and that's what I'm trying to do in some small way. Also, I have ambitions of someday being like an independent journalist. Next Max Blumenthal. Well, nobody can do what he's doing, but you know what I mean. Okay, this video is on Syria. And as everyone knows, the beginning of December, December 8th, or from beginning and middle of December, Syria collapsed. This whole Syrian state abruptly collapsed. It took everyone by surprise. I see it as a catastrophe in many ways. I'm not a fan of the Assad regime, but this is a major setback for the Palestinian struggle, for the anti-imperialist struggle, for the multipolar world, the non-aligned movements. I see this as a major setback. Right now what's happening, Israel has formally annexed the Golan Heights. They're occupying 3 times the size of Golan. The Syrian Canadian journalist Laith Marouf has said that 200,000 people have already been 200,000 Christians have fled into Lebanon. They're beginning ethnic cleansing. Syria is literally led by Al-Qaeda. Jolani is trying to act somewhat moderate, but he can't really control. He was literally the #2 guy in ISIS. He can't control his underlings, and Syrian state is destroyed. Israel is actually destroying any self-defense, any defense Syria might have had, utterly pummeling it, bombing the crap out of it. So Syrian state is gone effectively, and so much of the left has a really bad take on this. Some articles coming out from socialist groups. Well, the Assad dictatorship is gone. Now is there an opportunity for the left, or is it an opportunity for the working class? The short answer is no. The long answer is no. Syrian state is gone. There's no means whatsoever defending itself, and I don't see any way ahead. I think sadly it's going to end up like the Lebanese civil war, a 30-year-long struggle between different factions. I could be wrong. I don't really know how things will play out, but I'll get more of that. So anyway, I agree with people like Scott Ritter, Laith Marouf, so many other people. It's a catastrophe. I have major criticisms of the Assad government. Absolutely, it was a bad regime. But there's so many other things going on. As Laith Marouf said, Syria had a 100-year struggle against colonialism and imperialism. People talk about agency for Syria are just disrespecting the whole tradition Syria had in struggling against imperialism and colonialism since 1920, and it lost the struggle. It finally lost the struggle. And the Assad regime was bad, yeah, but we have to understand the material reasons. But before this, Laith Marouf said there were in Syria from 1942 to 1980, there were something like 8 coups, 8 foreign-backed coups. And that situation, it would be impossible for the Syrian state to turn out any other way than it has. So nothing happens in a vacuum. Anyway, so in this video, I'm going to talk about the early history of Syria, the 20th century history of Syria, the long struggle, the Syrian civil war, and the current situation, some of my take. I strongly disagree with the third campus, and I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so Syria, and I'm sometimes going to refer to my notes here. I'll try to keep this under a half hour. I probably won't succeed, but I'll see how it goes. So first, Syria, what we call Syria was Greater Syria, was a much larger region. What we know is Syria, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, part of what's now Turkey, sliver of what's now Turkey, northern sliver of what's now Saudi Arabia, part of Iraq, I believe to the Tigris River, and sometimes Cyprus. People include Cyprus with Greater Syria. It was a much larger region. It was the crossroads of ancient civilizations. Everybody was there. Hittites, Medes, Hurrians, Phoenicians, Carthaginians. Several Semitic groups fought over it. There was the location of the Aramaean Empire, which was a Semitic group. They didn't last very long, but they left their language Aramaic, which was then used by the Persian Empire, who took it over, and Aramaic became the international language of the Persian Empire for quite a while, and it was the language of Jesus, supposedly. And there are 2 towns in Syria which still speak Aramaic, very ancient language. Then, okay, it was part of the Persian Empire. Then it was part of the Greek Seleucid Empire, like Alexander the Great's empire, and I forget what year exactly, second century. Anyway, some of the second century BC around that time, third century. Um, his I actually am a little bit older, but his he Alexander died pretty young. Alexander the Great died pretty young. His empire broke up. Seleucid Empire was in Syria, like a chunk of it. Greek Empire. Then it was conquered by the Roman Empire, basically inherited. There were Roman ruins and Roman cities in Syria. Then it became part of the Greek, the Christian Byzantine Empire. Antioch, which was now it's now in Syria, but it's historically it was now in Turkey. It's historically part of Syria. Was an early center of Christianity. Then came the part of the Byzantine Empire. Then came the Muslim conquest, early 600s. I have here 634 to 640, the Arab conquest. And in the generation after the call, like Islam was founded in 611 AD, what they call a call. And then the generation after Muhammad, power shifted from Mecca to Damascus in the Umayyad Caliphate, which lasted for 90 years and was an early cultural high point of Islam. The Umayyad Mosque was built then. There are a lot of beautiful architecture. Then power later shifted further east to Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate, which was broke up, became much more diffuse. Then there were local caliphates in Syria, the Fatimids, which were based in Egypt. It was the center of the Crusader kingdoms. The Crusades were early attempt at European colonialism, basically. Actually, interestingly, Islam was far more tolerant than Christianity was. Christianity, for much of its history, was the most intolerant religion in the world. It was horrific. Muslims allowed Christian pilgrims, tolerated Christianity and Judaism and other religions. They allowed Christian pilgrims to go to the holy sites in Jerusalem and whatever. But when the Christian crusaders came to Jerusalem, they massacred everyone. It's a total massacre. And they had these crusader states. They tried to basically was exporting the contradictions of European feudalism, like landless peasants, gave them an opportunity to jump out of serfdom. For the lower level aristocrats, gave them a chance to carve out some land. It was an attempt to carve out a vast European empire in the Middle East. It failed, but they controlled the coast for a time. Eventually, the Crusader kingdoms, the biggest one, the main one, was the Principality of Antioch. Anyway, that lasted about 100 years. They didn't want to economically integrate to the hinterland, the rest of the Middle East. They eventually collapsed. They were there. Saladin was a famous general, a Muslim general. He was a Kurd, I believe. And he was connected, found the Ayyubid Sultanate. Anyway, he fought against Richard the Lionhearted, famous battles of that era. The Crusader kingdoms eventually collapsed. They're like an early attempt at what Israel later on was early stage of European colonialism. I guess you could look at it that way. Okay. Then there were local caliphates. Then the Syria became part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was from 516 to 1919, lasted 400 years. It was a sort of a Turkish-run Muslim empire. It was a vast area. It was originally the Byzantine Empire, and first the Turkic group, the Seljuk Turks, fought against them, made big inroads, and then the Osmanli Turks conquered it, founded basically it was the same location, but found the Muslim Ottoman Empire, and Syria was part of this for 400 years. There was a there's a depopulation for a time. Trade routes dried up. The Atlantic trade took away trade. Syria, for a while, became something of a backwater. Okay, now the modern era. Fast forward. The Ottoman Empire broke up in 1919. Now there was the Arab Revolt and the Treaty of Sykes-Picot, both of which, most of the countries of the modern Middle East were founded by the British. They're not ancient kingdoms. They don't go way back. They're mostly from the 20th century. The British the British and the French divided up the Middle East. Okay, what happened is the late Ottoman Empire was horrible. It was horrific. There was first there was a Turkey moved towards Turkish identity instead of Ottoman identity, moved towards Turkish, and the the Arabs were upset. There was a reverse move towards Arabism, Arab identity, and Arabs were being discriminated against. There's ethnic cleansing and genocide. The most famous was the Armenian genocide, but there were others. There are massacres of Circassians, Kurds, and other groups. Um, in World War One, in the First World War, the Ottoman Empire used the Arabs as cannon fodder, and there was horrific slaughter. Like in Greater Syria, a quarter of all males were killed. It was horrific slaughter, and there was a lot of tension. There was a Hashemite family. They were descendants of the Prophet Muhammad from one, I forget which line it was. Muhammad had several wives. I forget which line, but the Hashemites were guardians of Mecca, the holy place, in what's called the Hijaz, which is central, what's now known as Saudi Arabia. They were the traditional guardians, and the leader of the time, the Hashemites, looking at my notes here, the Hashemite leader was Hussein bin Ali, who launched this revolt in 2016, basically against the Ottomans. The trigger for it was the Ottoman governor of Syria had 18 Syrian notables, Syrian elite figures, and executed, and that was a trigger for this revolt. So Hussein bin Ali started this uprising. It was aided by the British. The British were very closely involved in this and basically quickly co-opted it. And there was the famous story of Lawrence of Arabia, the famous movie with Peter O'Toole, great movie. The British stabbed everyone in the back, and talk about perfidious Albion. The British were really horrible, betrayed everyone. Then there was the Treaty of Sykes-Picot, when the secret treaties the Bolsheviks revealed to the embarrassment of France. Anyway, secret treaty where Britain and France divided up the Ottoman Empire. Three provinces of the Ottoman Empire were cobbled together to form Iraq. They didn't have much in common with each other, just cobbled together. It was modified when oil was discovered in Basra. And Iraq did not have a historical consciousness of being a nation, of being a nation or a state. The word Iraq was kind of made up by the British. It's not even a historical name. It sounds like Uruk, the ancient Sumerian city of Uruk. The British archaeologists at the time were digging up and exploring, researching ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. So that's where it came from. Iraq is not a historical term, and it was not a consciousness of being a nation. They were mostly Arabs, Assyrians, Kurds, some other groups, but it was not a single nation. Okay. Anyway, so the British got Iraq, Jordan, what's called Transjordan, and Palestine. And their role in Palestine, of course, was later beyond horrific. And then the French, brought the French in, gave the French Lebanon and Syria. Lebanon was detached. It was historically part of Syria economically, but detached. And they set up this communal system so the Christians could dominate it. And the French got Syria. So early on, the British basically gave Syria to son of Hussein bin Ali. He was Prince Faisal the First. I believe he was one of the sons of Hussein, Prince Faisal, and they kind of set him up as king of Syria. Gave him a kingdom in Damascus, and it was essentially supposed to be a center of a vast Arab state. And the British set up the state for him, and he had some following. According to Laith Marouf, he wasn't particularly popular, and he was widely regarded as a British puppet, which he basically was. He did have some following, and he set up like a Arab government, but okay, so the French came in, pushed him out, he fled. But some of his not really followers, but some of the Arabs, some of the Syrians, they felt it necessary to fight, even though he fled, they wanted to fight the French. So there's a Battle of Misalon in 1920. So the French were then coming up through Lebanon along the coast. And Misalon, many of the notables of Damascus, of Syria, thought it was necessary to put up some resistance. France had, for World War I era, modern technology. And the Syrians had like 15th century cannons and stuff, very antiquated. It was a chaotic fight. They knew they'd be lost to the French. It was chaotic, but they felt they had to preserve the honor of the Arab nation. So this battle Muslim lasted 4 hours. It was a massacre. The Arabs were wiped out. The French won, and but they did it to preserve the honor of the Arab nation. And Laith Marouf has an ancestor, I think an uncle who fought in that, and another figure, Syrian girl, She's a Syrian journalist. She lives in Australia. She's a journalist, commentator, interesting person. She's on Twitter. She's her name Maram Susli, and she had like an uncle or great grandfather who fought in this battle as well. And they talk about this was an epic thing in the early Arab struggle against European colonialism. They lost the battle, so France occupied Syria. They divided it up into 5 regions, 3 Arab states, a state for the Alawites and a state for the Druze. So the Alawites and the Druze are religious minorities. They're basically a sects of Shia Islam. The Alawites are somewhat eccentric by mainstream Islam. They have a lot of ideas from Hinduism. They believe in reincarnation and some mystical ideas, probably some very ancient Gnostic ideas incorporated into Shia Islam. Anyway, they were generally discriminated against in the Ottoman period. There were pogroms against them. So the French actually brought them into the system. The bureaucracy the French set up was kind of had many Alawites in it, kind of divide and conquer, but they still had this Alawite state. Okay, so the French throughout the 20s, they tried to first enforce French culture, like Frenchify Syria, impose the French language and French culture on Syria, and they also tried to enforce colonial economic relations, make it like a traditional colonial dependency, like a colony source of raw material and raw materials at a captive market, and inhibit their own development, make it a colony. And of course, this was widely resented in Syria, and is from 1925 to 1927. It's called the Great Syrian Revolt or the Syrian Revolution, a huge uprising against the French, mostly led by the Druze. The Druze were always a very, very militant group. A guy named Pasha Ali Atasi was a big Druze leader during the time, and they initially won. They took the cities of Syria. But then the French were vastly outnumbered. But then my little chihuahua is coming here, Micah. Anyway, French were initially outnumbered, so they brought in troops from Morocco and Senegal, and they crushed the rebellion. By 1927, it was crushed. The French then sort of said they'd allow self-government. Ostensibly, it was under they were running Syria on a League of Nations mandate, prepare the Syrian people for self-government. That was kind of a joke, of course, but I'm sorry. That was kind of a joke, of course. So there was a lot of resentment. So the French did grant like a single state. They got rid of 5 different states. They had a single nation, and they did agree to eventual independence. And then not to mention this Great Arab Revolt, the French were horrific. There was one stage where the French began carpet bombing. Not carpet bombing. They created a firestorm in parts of Damascus. They had 24-hour aerial bombardment in the primitive plains of the area, but 24-hour aerial bombardment of outside of Damascus. And when the incident, apparently 26 Druze villages were destroyed. It was horrific. And another time, they had bombing all over the area of Syria they directly occupied, and 1 million people fled to like the other part of Syria, which was not occupied. It was horrific. The French were horrific. But anyway, they defeated the Syrians, and 1930 they granted a constitution. And 1936 was something of like a puppet government, the Treaty of Independence. They allowed like a corrupt puppet government, and the French said that they were going to permanently keep some areas of Syria. Well, people didn't like that. There was another leader, I think it was Bin Atassi was his name. I think he was Druze, I'm not really sure, but he led this uprising. There was something called the National Bloc, which was a coalition of Syrian independence groups, and there was a 60-day general strike. And the French, relented. They then allowed more or less a free election. They allowed an independence leader to take power. And then his power was the French again reneged. They refused to remove their army, and he was deposed. Then the Second World War came, and there was the Vichy French, collaborationist Vichy French government occupied Syria. And at the same time, Iraq went pro-German. There's a Hashemite monarchy, which were British puppets, but there was a regent running Syria, Hashemite regent. He was pro-German. And so, anyway, the Germans had an opening. They started to use Syria as a landing pad, as fueling for their planes, for their air force. Give them a place in the Middle East. So the British invaded Syria in 1941. This is not well known. Winston Churchill had ordered a media blackout, and no one didn't want to report on this, but the British were fighting the French, the Vichy French. They brought in Anzac troops, Australia, New Zealand troops, and Free French. Anyway, they put the Free French took over Syria. Okay. 1945, Second World War was over, but the French didn't want to leave Syria. They refused. They were moving very slow in withdrawing their military. It was widely hated by the Syrian people. There were mass protests and riots. One incident, in a big protest, the French fired into the crowd, killed 400 people, horrific massacre. There was street fighting. It was morphing into guerrilla warfare. And this was actually making the British position elsewhere somewhat untenable. So the British forced the French to leave in a sort of bizarre incident. 1945, the British invaded Syria, and they didn't shoot any French, as far as I know, but they kind of forced the French to leave. And Syrian people were cheering on the British. Kind of a wild incident, not well known. And the British, of course, elsewhere certainly played a horrific role, absolutely. But the British forced the French out. By 1946, Syria finally became independent. Okay. So 1947, there was a botched CIA orchestrated parliamentary coup. This is not well known, but there's a pretty wild story. I don't have all the details. There's an article I read a couple years ago, and I couldn't find it. But what happened is CIA was involved in closely what they called regulating the elections. They was vote rigging and paying off politicians. Some issue over land reform. The two parties were like the National Party and the Popular Party. They were both parties of the elite of the landowning oligarchs at the time. But the CIA tried to get involved, and it was botched. It was totally botched, and it created a huge amount of resentment. And a couple years later, 1949, there was what's widely believed to be a CIA orchestrated coup in 1949, a military coup. Backtrack a bit. There was the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Everyone knows about the Nakba, the horrific ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. 700,000 Palestinians were violently expelled. Zionist myth that they voluntarily left, which is absolutely not true. Anyway, a trigger for Arab intervention. The Arab states was a massacre of Deir Yassin village, horrific massacre. And the Arab nations finally invaded, the Arab states, surrounding Arab states invaded Israel to help liberate the Palestinian people. It failed. It was horrifically botched. Not well known, but Jordan, who was another Hashemite king, a puppet of the British, basically. Jordan made a secret deal with Israel that they would participate in this war. They kind of had to politically, but they would do it half-heartedly. So they would invade with half their force. They would do it half-heartedly, which they did. In return, they got the West Bank. Syria got the West Bank they stabbed any idea of a Syrian state in the back. They got the West Bank. The people there for a while were Syrian citizens until Israel got it back in 1967. Their occupation has been increasingly horrific. But anyway, so the Arab states lost the war big time as a catastrophe, and there were a lot of Syrians, as I remember, fought pretty well, but they got contradictory orders and was botched anyway. They were not ready for a major war. And there were a lot of recriminations. So in 1949, there was a coup. And in 1949 coup, so the president was Shukri al-Quwatli. Shukri al-Quwatli, who was kind of a conservative Arab nationalist of sorts, old school kind of guy. He had a lot of respect. Anyway, he was widely blamed for botching this Arab-Israeli war. And so a general, or not a general, I think it was a colonel, Hosni al-Zaim, overthrew him. Hosni al-Zaim. And widely believed it was orchestrated by the CIA. The CIA chief, Damascus chief at the time, a guy named Miles Copeland, wrote it in his memoirs, and he wrote a couple of books about it, claiming the CIA orchestrated it. There's been pushback. We don't really know if the CIA orchestrated it per se. The CIA certainly knew about Zaim and his associates, and they approved of the coup. But it's debatable whether they orchestrated it. It would have happened anyway. They certainly approved of it. Now, the motivation behind approving of it, oddly, it was believed, since Syria botched this 1948 war, they were believed to be vulnerable in a delicate situation. It was CIA feared that Syria might turn to communism. And there was a big fear back then the communists would take over. So they wanted a strong military leadership. Ironically, this coup made things much more unstable, but okay. So Zaim was certainly known to the CIA. They knew him and they worked with him. So he took power. So Zaim was in power for 4.5 months before he was overthrown. He did a few progressive things, actually improved women's rights. I believe gave women the right to vote. He tried to abolish the fez, the conical hat. I don't know why. I kind of like the fez. I don't know what was behind that, but anyway, he also was kind of petty. He had petty recriminations for minor things. He became unpopular. Okay, I'm going to backtrack a bit again. There's a political party in Syria which is still around and played a role, something called the Social Nationalist Party. They're kind of quirky, and I'm not really sure how to regard them. The Social Nationalist Party was founded by a guy named Anton Sidi in Beirut, Lebanon. Now, couple of both Syria and Beirut were occupied by the French. Syria and Lebanon were occupied by the French. So Lebanon was kind of regarded as a part of Syria, which basically is part of Syria. Anyway, so Anton Sidi, interesting guy. He was an intellectual, a playwright, an interesting character. He lived in the U.S. for years. Family owned a small business in New Mexico, interestingly. I think it was like a general store or something. And he worked there for a time. He lived in Argentina, which had a large, like, Lebanese, Syrian community. And then he came back in 1932. He formed the Social Nationalist Party. The idea, he was not an Arab nationalist at all. He thought pan-Arabism was ridiculous. He hated it. He was an extreme Syrian nationalist. He felt the greater Syria has a unique culture, and he had ideas from Russian mystical philosopher Nicholas Roerich, if I don't know how to pronounce it, Roerich, and basically that peoples have a kind of unique destiny and harmony with where they live and stuff. They have a unique destiny, kind of similar to Dugin, Alexander Dugin. Anyway, he apparently he said he wasn't. The party itself has some Nazi vibes, like social nationalist sounds like national socialist, and their symbol is a modified swastika. It's supposed to be a mixture of the Islamic crescent and the Christian cross. Sadi claimed he wasn't a Nazi. The Argentine branch were Nazi of his party were Nazis. He said, no, we're not. It's not a national socialist party. He said he rejected fascism. He said as bad as the French were, if the Germans or the French or the Italians occupied Syria, things would be much worse. I don't know. He rejected Nazism. I don't know what to make of this party. Actually, it's a bit quirky. They were regarded as on the right. They were, for around the 50s, no one trusted them. The left didn't trust them. They were regarded as U.S. Israeli puppets. Whether they were or not, I don't know. Then later on, they intervened in the Syria and the Lebanese civil war. They fought against the Phalangists, the Christian Phalangists in one incident. They fought against, and they became close to Hezbollah in the 2000s. And then they fought against the Ba'athists. The Ba'athists hated them, but then they had something of a rapprochement in the early 2000s, whatever. Anyway, they had anyway. So this guy Anton Sidi, his party was regarded as being part of this coup, part of the coup, part of this coup group, Zaim's coup, and they were friends. So Zaim invited Anton Sidi to Damascus to meet with, and he betrayed him. They had him arrested, sent to Lebanon. The Lebanese government at the time hated Sidi. They had like a quick show trial for him, and then he was shot. And this got a lot of people so upset. And also Zaim had these petty reprisals. He's a really childish, petty figure, and he became very unpopular. He in turn was overthrown after 4.5 months by one of his associates, Colonel Sami al-Hinaway. And Zaim was taken to prison and shot. And al-Hinaway ran Syria. Al-Hinaway ran into problems because he was regarded as overly pro-Iraqi. Iraq at the time had a Hashemite king who was a British puppet, and they were negotiating close to a merger between Syria and Iraq. And they were like maybe Arab nationalists, pan-Arabist, one an Arab state, but kind of conservative, more allied with the British or the U.S. And there was a lot of mistrust of this. Other factions of the elite mistrusted this, and al-Hinaway himself was overthrown after a few months. He was replaced by a guy named Al-Dib al-Shishlaki, if I pronounce his name correctly. Sorry, Adib al-Shishakli. Adib al-Shishakli. And Adib Shishakli made himself a dictator. He had a one-party state, kind of like National Arab Party, something like that. He was secretly spying on everybody, and he became pretty unpopular. He, in turn, was overthrown in 1954. Now, I'm going to backtrack a bit. The military my chihuahua's getting upset here. The military intervention broke the power of the landowning oligarchs. And ironically, allowed the middle class into the system somewhat. Parliamentary government wasn't really that representative, allowed more people into the system, but there was still downtrodden peasantry, there was class stratification, class unrest. So at the time, Syria had like 2/3 of all peasants did not own their own land. They were tenant farmers, and like 2,000 families in Syria controlled 3/4 of all wealth produced. There was wealth stratification. There had been a traditional alliance between the landowners and the peasants, but that broke down in the developing economy. There was a lot of unrest. So there's on the left developed the Communist Party, the Syrian Communist Party, which came out of the Lebanese Communist Party, and then the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party. My chihuahua is getting restless. So the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party. So, the Communist Party pro-Soviet Communist Party were kind of originally social democrats, and they didn't fight terribly hard for things. They originally were pro-Israeli. That didn't last long, but that lost them all of initial support. I think they could have played a bigger role than they actually did. They were eclipsed by the Ba'ath Party. Okay, so the Ba'athist Party was founded by several people, notably Michael Aflaq, who was a Syrian Christian school teacher. He lived in France. One of his comrades was a guy named Saladin al-Battar, and I believe that they were housemates for a while in France. They lived in France, and at least Aflaq was in the French Communist Party for a time. He was really disgusted by what he saw as the pro-imperialism of the French Popular Front, which was supported by the Communist Party. He left the French Communist Party, founded the Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party. They were supposed to be a type of Arab socialism. They believed in putting the commanding heights of the economy under public ownership, but not the rest of the economy. They apparently did not believe in class struggle, oddly, but they were socialist in a way. And then another figure, another figure was a guy named Zaki al-Urzuzi. Zaki al-Arzuzi. He was an academic and linguist. He had a theory that the Arab language is more in harmony with nature, more intuitive, that the Latin languages like French are linear and not in harmony with nature. And some ideas are kind of popular in parts of the global south, that the West is more linear and out of touch with nature. I don't know. Anyway, so he was actually not in the Ba'ath Party himself. He and Aflaq, or Zuzi and Aflaq, hated each other. They had this big rivalry. But he had later on kind of an outside influence on the Ba'athist Party. So the Ba'athist Party in Syria was founded, I think, in the 1950s. It took off. It was very popular among the peasantry, among religious minorities, the Druze especially, and Alawites. I don't know to what extent they were a working class party. Supposedly the first strike in Syria was organized by the Ba'ath. I don't know if they had a large working class following, but they did have a big peasant following and following from these religious minorities. They were, by the way, the Ba'ath were secular, but they were not as hostile to religion as the communists were. Okay, so as I was saying, in 1954, there was a coup. Shishakli was overthrown. He was despotic and widely disliked, and the leftist parties saw an opening. They didn't come to power then. There was a traditional conservative came to power in this 1954 coup. A guy, Al-Kawatli, who came back to power. He was, conservative nationalist, but an honorable guy and respected by everyone. Al-Kawatli was then succeeded. Al-Kawatli was basically but basically as a figurehead. And then in 1958, Syria merged with Egypt. That's a bit complicated. So in Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power. There was a coup, like a slow motion coup. The king was King Faoud. I think that's his name. He was corrupt. He came from an Armenian family, a corrupt playboy. He was pushed out of power like a slow motion coup led by the Free Officer Corps, and Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power. He was supposedly a socialist, certainly not a Marxist. One of his first things, he broke a textile strike and had other leaders hung in their workplace. But he nationalized the economy. It was supposedly socialist. I mean, I regard socialism as run by the working class. It was not run by the working class, but anyway, there was a famous Suez Crisis in 1956, where he got the British, the French, and the Israelis to back down. He got lucky, like geopolitically, he got really lucky. There was a moment of cooperation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and he got less or got lucky. Anyway, this made him wildly popular all throughout the Arab world. And so the initiative for a merger came from the Syrian army. The civilian leadership were basically puppets. Now, the motivation was from a couple different reasons. Part of it was instability. They felt the need for Arab nationalism was a big reason. The need for instability. So Nasser would provide some stability and prestige. That was a big part of it. Wikipedia is really interesting. Basically, Wikipedia is CIA. I mean, it's useful for finding out like the properties of the carbon atom or a new dinosaur discovery. It's somewhat useful. Not completely, but somewhat useful. But anything contemporary history or politics, it's the CIA, State Department, CNN, a view of the world. Look up Russiagate, look up just about anything. However, it's not entirely useless. I need to take it with a grain of salt and read in between the lines. You can get a lot out of Wikipedia actually if you know how to read in between the lines. They can't completely lie, but the way they emphasize things. So I noticed about Syria. I read up on Syria and Wikipedia a couple of years ago, and they completely rewrote most of their stuff. In fact, even the last rewriting was done a couple of days ago. I don't have screenshots. I can't prove this, but I know they rewrote. Distinctly remember it was different. I remember their motivation. The Wikipedia article said for the motivation of Syria joining Egypt was CIA meddling. They took that out of the current articles. They don't have that. But the original motivations was CIA meddling. I think that was definitely true. CIA probably was involved in some of these other coups. They were constantly playing off different groups, and this is widely hated. They joined Egypt largely protection from CIA meddling. Anyway, the merger with Egypt was supported by the left, by the communists and the Baathists. Michael Aflaq apparently gambled on the possibility that Nasser would have him as a junior partner. The Ba'ath Party would be part of this ruling group, even though the Ba'ath Party and the Communist Party were both banned in Egypt. Interestingly, Nasser was anti-communist. He hated Soviet communism. Even though he was a, quote, socialist and nationalist economy and close ties with the Soviet Union, he hated communism. However you define that. But the communists and the Ba'ath went along with it. Now, and so Michael Aflaq lost that gamble. It turned out that the Ba'ath Party was banned. Michael Aflaq actually liquidated his party without telling anyone, without consulting the membership or any discussions. We're liquidated. Go home now. And people really resented this. So anyway, what I say? Syria and Egypt were a single state for 3 years. It broke down. Combination of reasons. Nasser and the Syrian army were pretty heavy-handed. Hundreds of top-level Syrian officers were fired. It's basically run by the Egyptian military, or actually run by the Egyptian secret police. And they were pretty heavy-handed. It wasn't an equal merger. Syria was run as North Province. And also there's a conservative backlash. It was widely feared by the Syrian bourgeoisie, the business class, that Nasser would expropriate them like he did in Egypt. So it's kind of a conservative backlash. There was another coup against this, and there was kind of a standoff. It looked like there was going to be a war between Egypt and Syria. Nasser backed down and said, all right, if you guys want to be independent, don't let me get in your way. I'll leave Syria. And he did. Syria became Syria became independent. The United Arab Republic was just Egypt later. Egypt had mergers with several other countries, with several other states, which also didn't really work out. Egypt kept the name United Arab Republic until it was changed by Sadat, who finally recognized reality. Okay, the Ba'ath Party, people were really upset at Aflaq, and there was a radicalization. The military branch of the Ba'ath Party became more prominent. What they call the military committee came to power. Aflaq was still kept on as kind of a figurehead. He was the founder of the party, had prestige. But really, the military committee kind of ran the Ba'ath Party, and they became much more radicalized. And so there was a coup in, I think it was, there was a coup in 1961 when Syria left the United Arab Republic, and another coup, I think it was in 1963 when the Ba'athis came to power. There was, in conjunction, the signal for that was the Ba'athist coup in Iraq. So the Ba'athis came to power. It's called the March 8th Revolution. The Ba'athis came to power, and Saladin al-Battar was the leader. So anyway, there was the buddy of Michael Aflaq, Saladin al-Battar ran, who was the first Ba'athist leader. There was a radicalization within the Ba'athist movement and within the military, something known as neo-Ba'athism. Now, as far as I understand, this philosophy was less of an emphasis on pan-Arabism, which was one of the foundations of Baathism, more on like proletarian internationalism, more moved towards Marxism, more towards a wholesale nationalization of the economy. Some people talk about worker self-management, closer relations with the Soviet Union. At one point, Aflaq said, I don't recognize this party. And eventually, Albator was pushed out of power. He went to France later on. Years later, he was assassinated in France by the Assad government. And there was the 1966 Jadid government took over with a leader of the Neo-Baaths. Jadid, interesting. Jadid was 1966. Saleh Jadid came to power, and he was much more radical, much more to the left than al-Battar was. Tariq Ali, who's a famous Pakistani British writer, historian, activist, he said that he kind of likes this group. He said they represent the best chance to move Syria forward. They had Jadid had thoroughgoing, had a nationalization, became a state-run nationalized economy. There's massive land reform. The estates were broken up and peasants got land. He made some very positive reforms. He was also Jadid was an Alawite, but Alawite background, but he hated religion. He thought it was superstition. He was very anti-religious. Tariq Ali said he represented the best chance to move Syria forward. That didn't happen though. He was in power for 3 years. Then he was overthrown by his own defense minister, Hafez al-Assad. Hafez al-Assad was part of this neo-Baathist group, but it's kind of represented a conservative backlash within neo-Baathism. Basically, was it 1970, I think it was September 1970, the Black September incident in Jordan? Okay, Jordan was run by a Hashemite British puppet. It still is. Half the population of Jordan is Palestinian. And they were radicalized. They were radicalizing influence there. The Al Fatah, which is a group in the PLO, today they're corrupt collaborationist puppets, the Palestinian Authority. But back then, Al Fatah were revolutionaries. They actually were badass revolutionaries. They had occupied this border town in Jordan. They attacked Israel from this town in Jordan. They attacked Israel, and then the Jordanian government tried to crack down on them. So in retaliation, the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a Marxist-Leninist group run by founded by George Habash and Layla Khalid. They're famous for hijacking planes. And real innocent, they hijacked 3 civilian airliners, made everyone get off. They didn't kill anybody, made everyone get off, and they blew up the planes. Like, whoa, this is a badass move. Like, whoa. So Jadid wanted to intervene, wanted to invade Jordan, like export the revolution in support of the PFLP, like export the revolution. And so Assad had a coup, and there was growing tension between Assad's faction and Jadid. Most of the Ba'ath leaders supported Jadid, but there was a bit of a standoff. Jadid at one point tried to fire Assad, but wasn't really able to. So he had a coup and overthrew Jadid's government, and the top leaders were made ambassadors to Eastern Europe or whatever. Jadid said, to Assad, if I ever come back to power, I'm going to have your body dragged from a truck. So as a result, Hafez al-Assad put him in jail for the rest of his life. He died in prison in 1992. It seemed like that was the best opportunity to move Syria forward. According to Tariq Ali and other writers, so anyway, Assad took over. Hafez al-Assad, the father of the more recent leader, Bashar al-Assad. And what Assad did, one of the first things he did, he kind of brought the bourgeoisie back into the system. It was still, as far as I understand, it was largely a nationalized economy, but some of the former business owners could keep their investments. They had some role in their companies. They had some role. I don't quite understand it, but it was kind of a compromise with the bourgeoisie. And of course, a system like that invites a lot of corruption. He what else? What else? So he it was regards to, it was understood, it was regarded as a radical Arab state. They supported the Palestinian cause. They supported the PFLP. There was actually several splits in the PFLP group. I think it's the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine split. They thought the PFLP was too close to Syrian bureaucracy. They were probably right. There's another group, the PFLP General Command, which joined Assad's army. You see the Syrian Arab Army as a faction in it. Kind of interesting splits. Anyway, Assad was a radical, was regarded as a radical Arab state, made some compromise with the bourgeoisie, but was regarded as a radical Arab state, supported the Palestinian cause, close ties with the Soviet Union. There were several theories on the left to typify it, like what you call third world developmentalist states, Syria, Egypt under Nasser, Burma, or some other places. So there was a Soviet theory by someone named Karen Brutens, who's a male writer, wrote about what he called bourgeoisie bureaucracy, bourgeoisie bureaucrats following a non-capitalist path. What this kind of meant, as far as I understand, meant like the bourgeoisie, kind of a bureaucratic role. Like Syria was developing towards some kind of socialism, but wasn't run by a Soviet Communist Party. There were other theories that Tony Cliff, who was Cliffide, founder of what became the British Socialist Workers' Party. I don't really like Tony Cliff or agree with him, but he had a theory of what he called deflected permanent revolution. In an earlier video, I talked about Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, idea that basically the French Revolution was the last time the bourgeoisie played a progressive role. Later developing countries, they would not be able to play this role. It would be up to the working class to push change from below. Okay, Tony Cliff had the idea that this was deflected, and this would lead to a type of state capitalism. And he used it to justify state capitalist theory, which I disagree with. Hardly the Spartacus League. The Sparts have kind of a version of this theory themselves. They reject the developmental states. They're all corrupt. They think they're all like capitalist. I don't really agree. Ted Grant, British Trotskyist, originally from South Africa. He was founder of the CWI and then the IMT. And I was in the Socialist Alternative. I was in the CWI. I no longer am, but I have kind of a soft spot for Ted Grant. Some of his ideas are interesting. Basically, he had an idea of what he called proletarian Bonapartism. Basically, a Bonapartist government is from Marx's writings on the Civil War in France and what happened to France after the Revolution of 1848 flopped. Louis Napoleon had power, and he bounced off class forces like no class. It was a capitalist society essentially, but no class was really strong enough. So he played off the peasants against the bankers, financed capital against the working class, and sort of a balancing act for a while. And he was like a comic opera dictator for 20 years. So there are many Bonapartist leaders. Syria and other similar states were proletarian Bonapartists. It wasn't run by the working class, but it was like collectivized state economy, which is proletarian. Now it was an attempt by like the bourgeoisie, the military bureaucratic bourgeoisie, kind of nationalize the economy to try to jumpstart things, find a way to develop the economy. They weren't really interested in socialism or working class. They wanted to find a way of forced development, develop the economy. They weren't able to and do it themselves, and they were hoping maybe to jumpstart a new bourgeois class. Independent development. This happened in Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro. I made an earlier video about this. Find some separate direction for development. Overall, though, was what Trotskyists call a deformed Syria. I think was a deformed worker state with some eccentricities, but it was a deformed worker state. It wasn't socialist, wasn't run by the working class, but it wasn't capitalist either. It was a post-capitalist economy, and then the role would be to political revolution to put the working class in charge. Basically, Ted Grant's theory makes most sense to me. By the way, I have to give a shout out to some of the people at Leftist Train Spotters Facebook group. I studied this stuff years ago. I forgot a lot of it. I have read a lot of Ted Grant years ago. I've forgotten it. But they remind me, posted some really useful information, and I'm grateful for this. Okay, so Assad, there was economic development under Assad. Like 10 years, Syria developed, from a backward, rural economy to an industrial state, to a second-tier industrial state. It was wasn't super wealthy, but it was a second-tier industrial society. From the 1980s, the Syrian economy began running into some problems. Okay. And they had to open up the economy somewhat, began the third world debt crisis, whole complicated things, began running into problems in the 1980s. That's another story. There was a Muslim Brotherhood attack in the 70s. First, Syria intervened in the Lebanese Civil War. Lebanese Civil War is extremely complicated. It went on for 30 years. Syria intervened, and they initially ended the war, but then started up again. Went from like 30 years. That finally ended in 1990. And Syria intervened in 1976. This was a trigger for a Muslim Brotherhood uprising. Backtrack a bit. The Muslim Brotherhood came out of Egypt in the 1920s. They were like super vicious sectarian Sunni Muslims. Now, it's unusual in Islam. Islam, for much of its history, has been a more of a tolerant religion, actually. This represents a fundamentalism, extremist version of Islam. It was what some anthropologists might call a revivalist movement. Like a lot of colonial countries which have been colonized and subjugated by the West, they were looking for a way to revive their society. And this is kind of like a revivalist movement, return to basics, return like the ghost dance religion of Native Americans was something like that. They kind of some extent represent a way to return to basics, extreme conservatism, one direction. So Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt fought against the British. They assassinated British officials. They again fought against the secular government. They were sometimes used by the British. They were used by the U.S. and by the colonial powers. They're what's one wing branch of what's called political Islam. The term Muslim fundamentalism is not used anymore. Muslims say all Muslims are fundamentalists. They have to believe the Quran is completely true. All Muslims are fundamentalists, but the Muslim Brotherhood and these other groups are political Islam. Another branch are the Saudi Salafists. They're like Al Qaeda, ISIS, similar groups come out of Wahhabi Islam, a very strict interpretation. Anyway, this is not historically it's not been the dominant type of Islam, but there are the Salafist groups. So there are two various currents of political Islam. There's another current, more or less coming out of Shia Islam, the Houthis or various Iranian factions. There's the Houthis, the Ansar Allah movement, had released a manifesto like a couple months ago saying they agree with Marxism. They're fully compatible with Marxism. They don't have any problems with it. Their type of Islamic liberation theology. There's this guy, academic, I think he's in the U.S., Hamid Dabashi. He was developed Islamic liberation theology. I'm not a Muslim. I'm not a believer at all. I'm just saying this exists. Whether it's good or not, that's another thing. But this represents a type of anti-imperialist political Islam. And there was this guy in Iran, Ali Shariati, who lived in France. He was friends with French existentialist philosophers. And he tried to develop a fusion of Marxism and Islam. And he has had some influence in Iran. Now, I'm not saying, you could critique this from a Marxist viewpoint. Absolutely. I'm just saying it exists. This represents more of an anti-imperialist current, other than the Salav, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Saudi groups, which are horrible, which are right-wing horrible. Okay. So anyway, the Muslim Brotherhood were conservative. They represent kind of the religious faction of the landowners, the expropriated landowners, and the bourgeoisie. Not all of them supported the Muslim Brotherhood, but they drew their strength from the expropriated Sunni landowners. And also Assad, when Hafez al-Assad carried out land reform, they had agitation. They put it in sectarian religious grounds. Like they appealed to landless Alawite peasants. The Alawites are only like 10% of the population. They appealed to landless Alawite peasants against the Sunni landowners. They put it in sectarian grounds, which created a lot of resentment. And also the Assad government was top-heavy with Alawites. He placed there for people he could trust. So it's seen as like an Alawite. Alawites are kind of regarded as heretics, an Alawite heretical regime, oppressing Muslims. The Muslim Brotherhood put things in the frame. And they launched several uprisings in the late 70s. They were horrible. They targeted educated people. They were massacred educated people, school teachers. There was one incident in Aleppo where they killed like 100 cadets who were graduating from military school. They targeted any school teachers, professors, anybody identified with science or secular education or the Ba'athist regime. And there were several attacks like this. Assad cracked down the Hama massacre. There's debate about what happened in Hama and how it played out, and I don't really know myself. Mainstream accounts say 40,000 people were killed. This took reprisals out on Sunni civilians. Whether that's true or not, I think other sources claim it's exaggerated. Tim Anderson wrote what I think is a pretty balanced book on Syria. He says, it was a civil war. And he thinks maybe between 8,000, 6 to 8,000 people were killed. It doesn't look like Assad wantonly massacred civilians. He could have. I don't know. NPR a couple of years ago had a thing that interviewed supposedly about a school in Hama where everyone's father had been killed. And it's NPR. Take NPR like Wikipedia with a big grain of salt. But I don't know. It very well could have. So I could have taken savage reprisals on people who were believed to support the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know how it played out, but um, Robert Fisk, a journalist, he died, Middle East, expert in the Middle East, brilliant writer. He died a couple of years ago. He, I think, estimated between 10 and 20,000 people were killed in Hama. It was a civil war situation. I don't know how it played out. And like later, I think in 1980, the Muslim Brotherhood almost assassinated Assad. Hafez al-Assad. They threw a hand grenade at him. One of his bodyguards jumped on the hand grenade, and it didn't. And he survived. Actually, surprisingly, he was massively promoted afterwards and narrowly killed Assad. And you're not going to be too nice to people who narrowly kill you. Anyway, so I have a feeling the fight with the Muslim Brotherhood would have happened in any situation. But I think under Jadid, it probably would have played out a little differently. Maybe not so much under religious sectarian grounds. Who knows? I don't know. Okay, where are we? Where are we at then? Assad, Hafez al-Assad, by the way, supported the U.S. in the first Iraq War, the Persian Gulf War. It was a country run by a different faction of the same political party. Oddly, he supported the U.S. He's hated Saddam Hussein, hated Saddam. The Syrian Ba'ath Party, by the way, they broke. They broke with the Iraqi Ba'aths. The Neo-Ba'ath is seceded from the Syrian General Council. By the way, their Ba'ath parties, supposed to be pan-Arab party. There were Ba'ath parties elsewhere too, in Jordan and in occupied Palestine, elsewhere. There were Sudan. There were attempts to organize Ba'ath parties elsewhere. It wasn't just, but the places that came to power were Syria and Iraq. And okay, so that's the situation. So in 2000, Hafez al-Assad died. Bashar al-Assad, his son, took power. Bashar al-Assad took power. Hafez al-Assad's oldest son was originally groomed to be president. My chihuahua was going berserk here. Hafez al-Assad's older son, a guy named Bassel Assad. Bassel al-Assad, oldest son, he died in a car crash in 1994. The story is he was going to a ski vacation in Germany, and he was riding a Mercedes. He liked driving fast. According to one account, he was apparently clocked at driving 140 miles an hour. It might be 140 kilometers an hour, which would be 70 miles an hour, still pretty fast. And he hit a highway divide, and he died in the hospital a few hours later. And just looking at him, he doesn't look like a socialist revolutionary. He's a corrupt playboy figure. But anyway, um, uh, Bashar al-Assad was originally not interested in politics. He was studying optometry in the UK. He didn't want to go into politics, but he came back after his brother died. He came back to Syria. He kind of worked his way up the bureaucracy, and he became president in 2000. Bashar al-Assad became president of Syria, leader of Syria in 2000. And he originally was something like regarded as a young reformer. There was what's called he allowed freedom of speech, people to criticize the regime. There's what's called the Damascus Spring. It lasted for about a year, and there were a lot of debate, some lively debate, mostly among intellectuals. There were like salons, like places you could hang out and discuss things and openly discuss things, literary salons all over Damascus. Marxists and socialists participated in this. There was for a while a lot of ferment. It was abruptly ended the end of 2001. The bureaucracy felt threatened. They pressured Bashar to crack down, and he did. Some of these people was abruptly ended, and some of these people were thrown into prison, tortured. The bureaucracy felt threatened by this. Okay, as I said, there were. I mentioned there was rapid development to industrial economy. But, the Ba'athist regime was a brutal police state. I'm not saying it wasn't. It was a brutal police state. But, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean you don't have enemies. They were attacked by Tim Anderson, writer, says much of the repression of Bashar's regime were conditioned by the Muslim Brotherhood uprising. They were constantly under attack and they were paranoid. So it tells them to become more authoritarian. Okay, so there was this Damascus Spring, which was ended. 2004, U.S. Congress passed the Syrian Accountability Act, which was some of the stuff coming out of the Bush administration, supposedly punishing Syria for weapons of mass destruction, which didn't exist, but like the Iraq had WMDs, supposedly punishing Assad for this. By the way, the first U.S. sanction against Syria was in 1979 under the Jimmy Carter administration. After it was ostensibly in retaliation for Syria invading Lebanon, but it's really in retaliation for Syria for Assad expropriating the bourgeoisie. The U.S. had to punish them. That was the real reason. Okay, anyway, so there's a Syria Accountability Act in 2004, ostensibly punishing Syria for weapons, WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and things like that. 2005, what's called the Damascus Declaration. There was, I think it was a repressive police state. It was very corrupt. It was increasing any closed system like that becomes very corrupt. There was resentment against the corruption, endemic corruption, the Ba'ath monopoly of power, the state emergency, the police state. A lot of resentment again, growing resentment against this. And this Damascus Declaration signed in 2005. Leftists and libertarians signed it. Leftists and liberals signed it. Briefly, the Muslim Brotherhood, who had been in opposition, they tried to overthrow the government. They also signed this as well. They quickly backed away. The concept of freedom of speech for the Muslim Brotherhood is a bit problematical. They signed it, but then they backed away. So there was this movement coming out of the Damascus Spring of 2000-2001. Okay, so there was a drought in 2006 onward, 2006, a horrific drought, possibly stemming from climate change. Much of the rural economy in northern and eastern Syria was destroyed, was devastated. There were refugees. There were efforts to take care of this. There were relief efforts, and the Syrian government worked with the UN and the Muslim Crescent, the Red Crescent, whatever it's called, international relief organizations. They did. It's believed the U.S. Syria Accountability Act blockaded Syria from any U.S. trade, except for food and medicine, supposedly. But it made relief efforts much more difficult. There's probably endemic corruption also. And also the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafist groups sponsored by Saudi Arabia and Qatar infiltrated, like Tim Anderson, Laith Maruf, other writers talk. Dr. Mohammed Morandi, who's an Iranian academic. He's a dean of the school. He's Iranian expert on American culture, basically. And he's a commentator on indie media channels. He has an interesting analysis. He said a lot of Saudi or Qatari-based Salafist groups infiltrated, and they made a lot of trouble in these villages. Appealed to some of these peasant refugees, and the relief efforts were not fully adequate. There was resentment, it looked like a neglect. There was a lot of corruption, absolutely. So the Slavs being infiltrating the Syrian in. Now, okay, fast forward. 2011, there was famous Arab Spring. And there was a vegetable guy selling vegetables at a farmer's market in Tunisia. He'd been harassed by the police for a long time. He finally set himself on fire in protest. They made his life miserable. Set himself on fire in protest. This triggered mass protest in Tunisia, and then spread to Egypt. This famous Arab Spring, Tahrir Square, hundreds of thousands of people protested. Now, at the time, some people on the left thought this was a color revolution, and might have been. I think a lot of the protests were maybe initially spontaneous, but what happened is Egypt was facing a succession crisis. Hosni Mubarak had been in power for like 40-something years. He succeeded after Sadat was assassinated by the Muslim Brotherhood. Mubarak was a gruff Air Force general. He initially was somewhat popular, but that faded off. He had been in power for years. He was 81. He had dementia. and he was deeply unpopular. The system was very corrupt. The police were brutal and repressive. There was one story that police outside Cairo stopped a male motorist, made him get out of the car, and then gang raped him. The story probably wasn't true, but it was widely believed. This was spread everywhere. Why? This shows the corruption of the police and of Egypt at the time. This was mad. Now, to some extent, this may have been, I think the protests, to some extent, were spontaneous, but they were quickly hijacked. Now, Max Blumenthal and other people talk about a guy named Gerald Cohen, who wrote a book, Digital Democracy. And he, was a big proponent of early social media in the early 2000s for spreading democracy and freedom and liberty and the American way of life. And he was picked up by the State Department, the CIA. He successfully lobbied Twitter in Iran when a major protest movement was in, I think it was Green Revolution in Iran, I think it was called. He lobbied Twitter to not shut down. Twitter's going to shut. No, we got to keep Twitter. Twitter's going to shut down for me. No, we got to keep Twitter going. And he pioneered the use of social media to spread the U.S. message some of these regimes, and his big influence. And then Max Blumenthal describes how the CIA picked up his stuff and quickly weaponized it within Syria and elsewhere. And there were legitimate grievances, absolutely, but it was spread through social media and weaponized in certain directions. So it's a bit, things were partially spontaneous, but kind of the Cola Revolution kind of directed in certain ways. So in 2011, the protests spread to Syria. There was the Dara incident, which is there are conflicting stories of what happened. The mainstream story I remembered years ago, a couple of young boys, or one young boy in particular, was writing obscene graffiti and a picture of Assad, a billboard of Assad, and writing obscene graffiti. This was imitation of what people were doing in North Africa at the time. Anyway, the police arrested him, mutilated him, killed him, and then said to his family, you can pick up your son's body. If we have your son's body, you can pick it up anytime. Then more next day, protesters came out. The police shot a couple of people. Then hundreds of people came out to protest. Tim Anderson and other writers says, no, it's not the way it happened. Actually, Assad personally intervened to get this kid released. He wasn't killed or mutilated, get released, and sacked the leadership. Assad intervened to try to turn things around. And fired the local leadership and tried to turn things around. Now, also, I mentioned earlier, as I said, it was the Ba'athist regime was corrupt, very corrupt. The side came to power. He tried to crack down. There's massive corruption in Lebanon. They occupied Lebanon. There's massive corruption. And there was a brutal police state. Absolutely. I'm not saying it wasn't. There was legitimate discontent, but the CIA and the U.S. imperialism weaponized this in certain directions. Assad tried to turn things around. He had these citizens' initiatives for youth, for women, for different groups. They were kind of supposed to be like ombudsmen, try to circumvent the bureaucracy and bring average people more into this, like Scandinavian ombudsman system. It didn't quite work, but tried to give average people more of a say in the system. It didn't really work, but my understanding of it. So it's not that evil dictator Assad is genociding his own people. He was a pretty in-out. He was kind of regarded as a prisoner of the bureaucracy. It was a corrupt bureaucracy, and he tried to do well. I think he was a well-meaning guy in his own way. He wasn't a bloody tyrant. He was kind of inept and politically inadequate, but he had inherited a really bad situation. So anyway, so two things. 2011. The Saudis and the Salafists were weaponizing this CIA, and there was legitimate discontent. I'm not saying there wasn't. Now the Dara incident. So I mentioned the story about the young boys. Assad intervened to rescue this kid, sacked the local leadership, and tried to turn things around. It didn't really work. Apparently, it was infiltrated by Salafists. There were shooting incidents and there was gunfire there. It mushroomed out. And so there were mass protests all over Syria, on and off for about 7 months. And Assad called 2 meetings of opposition leaders, liberals and leftists, to try to find a way forward. Didn't really do anything. They were older and old school and didn't seem to have much of a connection with the protesters on the street, as far as I know. The demand for the protesters was Assad must go. Now, in Egypt, I think that was an appropriate slogan. Mubarak go out. That was a bad English, but that was In Syria, it's a little complicated. They need something like a transitional program, some demands, but no, just Assad must go. And it was quickly weaponized by the U.S. and by imperialism. Okay, so the Syrian morphed into a civil war situation. Some units of the Syrian Arab Army mutiny, but more. The U.S. is known from 2011 to 2014. U.S. spent $5 billion in Operation Timber Sycamore, and the Gulf states also spent billions of dollars, I don't know how much, to basically create a jihadi civil war. Now, the Islamist groups had no connection with the urban protesters. The war was not an organic outgrowth of the urban protests. They were two separate things. There was early on, Hillary Clinton organized the Syrian National Council (SNC), which is kind of supposed to be a government in exile. It didn't work out that way, and they tried very hard to get the Damascus Declaration people, the movement, to sign on to this, and they didn't want anything to do with it. The opposite, leftists and liberal oppositionists, kind of made their peace with Assad. Okay, we don't like the Ba'athist regime, it's horrible, but right now it's the lesser evil. We're not going to support foreign supported jihadis destroying our country to overthrow Assad. It's not what we want. And then, anyway, so the Syrian National Council, several of the so-called Free Syrian Army was supposedly a national army. There's actually several militias, not really unified military. They were basically Muslim Brotherhood. And then there was another Free Syrian Army. Then there was the, I believe, Syrian National Army. Hillary Clinton tried to broaden out this SNC to include more people. It didn't really work. Some Kurdish groups joined it, but it didn't really work. And then there was several militias, but they all were basically puppets of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were puppets of Turkey. They still exist, but they're based in Istanbul, the puppets of Turkey right now. And then there were other groups. There were more Saudi jihadist groups. At one point, there were like 14 groups who took a big charge of Syria, big control, a big chunk of Syria. They came dominated by Jabhat al-Nusra, which was Al-Qaeda in Syria. And Jabhat al-Nusra had a falling out with Al-Qaeda over, like, they wanted to keep it more of a Syrian struggle, while Al-Qaeda saw it as international struggle. They had the same ideology, same vicious religious obscureness ideology. They had the same ideology, but fight over resources, basically. And then ISIS came out of al-Nusra. Al-Nusra were the most vicious, violent groups, many atrocities. They were a pole of attraction for some of these other Islamist groups, and they absorbed them. They eventually became the dominant Islamist group. So anyway, there were massacres. Supposedly, there was the Hula massacre, where about 100 people were massacred. It was horrific. No one knows who did it. The mainstream view, Wikipedia just say the Assad government killed 100 people. We don't know that. No one knows who did it. There's no definitive proof. There's no definitive proof. Maybe it was, but carried out by the Assad government. Nobody knows. It's not definitive proof. Then there were the poison gas attacks. There was a chlorine gas attack at Douma in 2018 that came towards the end of the civil war. There are allegations that Syria dropped two chlorine gas canisters, killed 43 civilians in April of 2018. That's horrible. And Aaron Mate of the Gray Zone. There were two OPCW whistleblowers. They claimed said they were politically pressured to say the Assad government did this. We really don't know who did it. Politically or militarily, it wouldn't make any sense for them to do it. They had already taken that area. There were people basically supported the Assad government. And then there was the East Ghouta massacre a little bit earlier, where 100 people were killed, supposedly by sarin gas. A daughter of an opposition leader who was supposedly working for some relief group, went there. She sniffed like a dead body. Oh yeah, the sarin gas, which was absurd because sarin instantly kills. It's a highly toxic nerve agent. Okay, I'm not saying it was a good regime. Assad government was a good regime, but they were not guilty of the atrocities which they were accused of. There was massive propaganda push, massive in the Western media, to demonize Assad. There was Assad family dictatorship, the brutal Assad tyranny, on and on. The white helmets, which were made up by British intelligence, they were a construct of British intelligence. They were posed as a relief agent, relief organization. They were working with the Islamists totally. And the whole thing, there was a massive, like, became a cottage industry, massive propaganda push. There was Syrian girl Abed, who supposedly wrote this letter, like, "Dear American President Obama, evil Assad is killing us. Please send rocket launchers," or something like that. There were jokes about it in Facebook memes. Later on, a version of that was in Venezuela, like, "Dear President Trump, evil dictator Maduro is killing us. Please send rocket launchers," something like that. So that was going on. Anyway, ISIS in 2014 or so, they took over a big chunk of Iraq. They developed a huge state. And the U.S. puppet Iraqi army, Sunni, basically collapsed. They completely collapsed. And they took over Sunni. ISIS briefly had a huge ISIS caliphate, capital Raqqa in Syria. And the U.S. intervened, came back. The Kurds fought very well in several battles. They fought very well. And ISIS was starting to carry out horrific ethnic cleansings of the Yazidis, a Kurdish religious group of the Kurds. That was going on. So Russia intervened in 2015. I think now, according to Jim Kavanaugh, the trigger for Russian involvement was that the U.S. was going to directly engage the Syrian Arab Army, which means U.S. was going to overthrow Assad. That was a stated purpose over and over again. U.S. was going to invade, going to overthrow Assad, and it would have been a catastrophe. It would have been like Libya. Assad, the jihadis would have carried out horrific ethnic cleansing. They still might. Would have devastated Syria. This would have been tremendously destabilizing to Central Asia, to southern Russia. Geographically, Syria is not that far from Russia. Russia intervened, and I think they played a progressive role for reasons of their own. For reasons of their own, they're not good. Putin's not a good guy but for reasons of their own. John Kerry actually said, he spilled the beans. He was Secretary of State after Hillary Clinton. He said, the goal was to create a attack-free state in central Syria, which came close to happening. ISIS was on the outskirts of Damascus. They almost took Damascus. Russian intervention prevented that. Now, there were the Kurds. The Kurds had the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, leftist Kurdish party in Turkey. They had the YPJ in Syria, the Syrian affiliate of it. They're Bookchinites, followers of Murray Bookchin, who was an eccentric American anarchist. Murray Bookchin had been in the American left for a long time. He was in the Communist Party in the 30s. He ran for mayor of Bayonne, New Jersey, I believe, in the 30s. Then he became a Trotskyist. He was in the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party for a time. He left. He developed a type of ecological anarchism. He moved to Vermont. He had the Center for Social Ecology in South Royalton, Vermont, which is near where I went to high school for a time. I remember that. I never met him. But then he moved to Burlington, Vermont. He had a bitter feud with Bernie Sanders. At one point, Bernie Sanders had his ex-wife arrested at an anti-war demonstration. Bitter feud with Bernie. They hated each other. And he apparently later years, he had Alzheimer's. He was a bit of a cantankerous fellow from what I've heard. I've never met the guy. He had some interesting ideas. I read one of his books, The Political Ecology of Freedom, which is kind of interesting. Talking about peasant uprisings in Europe and elsewhere. It was somewhat interesting. He developed a type of mutualism, or municipalism. I don't totally understand his philosophy. I haven't wrapped my head around it. Bookchinites I've spoken with seem basically like confused social democrats. I don't think they have a coherent ideology. But anyway, the PKK and the YPJ picked up on they became Bookchinites, which they had the idea of socialism in one small canton, one small community. And the Kurds, though, had this based on the U.S. military. Like, you can't have socialism in one country. You can't have socialism in one canton backed by like 2 U.S. Marine Corps bases, which is basically what they were doing. And then they had the YPJ. If the U.S. kind of backed them and fought alongside them at times against ISIS and other groups. Interesting, the U.S. fought ISIS, but did not fight them when they were attacking the Assad government. They only fought ISIS when they were attacking other Islamists or the Kurds. They fought in protection of the Kurds. But otherwise they were okay with ISIS fighting Assad's government. They were totally okay with that. And ISIS collapsed, and they basically became puppets of Turkey and to a certain extent the U.S. They are still around. Fragments of it are still around. Okay, so yeah, so the Kurds became like Rojava became like a celebrity cause in the Western left. This guy David Graeber, he was an anarchist and academic, died a few years ago. He became prominent around Occupy movement. He was a big promoter of Rojava, and I think you're just missing the point. I mean, the Kurds are in a difficult situation, absolutely, but they're side with U.S. imperialism, which was not the way to go. They had to make peace with Assad, and the U.S. guarantees going to betray them. Okay, so this guy Bryce Belden, he was named Piss Pig Granddad, and he became a Twitter celebrity, young American guy, supposedly converted to Marxism on his own. Then he joined the Kurds in Riyadh and fought for them. He became like a Twitter celebrity for a time, around 2015, 16, something like that. He claimed he thought the Kurds were too close to U.S. imperialism, so he came back. There were a number of young American radicals who fought with the Kurds at different times. There were some conservative American mercenary types who joined the Kurds and found, oh, they're communists. I didn't know that, stuff like that. But there's suspicion that Bryce Belden was CIA. I don't know that for sure. It could very well be true. So it gets it's a complicated situation. U.S. Yeah. So so a little disjointed here, but so Obama said many times that use of poison gas in Syria is going to be a red line. If Assad uses poison gas, that'll be a complete red line. And he said that several times, which is practically inviting someone to use poison gas, and finally someone did. There was the the East Ghouta crisis, where supposedly sarin gas was used. No one knows who did it. It doesn't seem likely it was the Assad government. So what happened is Russia intervened. U.S. was going to use it, almost invaded Syria at that time. Russia intervened and said, we'll take any poison gas Syria might have and kind of diffuse the crisis. U.S. later did intervene a little bit later with ISIS. So Russia temporarily diffused that crisis. And later Russia intervened in 2015 and pushed the jihadis into Idlib. And they remained there for like 7 years, pushed the jihadis into Idlib. And there were atrocity stories that, now I disagree with the third campus. I'm saying, the worst. I don't think Assad was the worst thing there. The U.S. imperialism was, and the jihadis were vastly worse. It's always the case. U.S. imperialism is the primary contradiction in this. So U.S. is always U.S. imperialism is always the main enemy. As it said, Assad was committing genocide against his own people, which is nonsense. Genocide his own people. It didn't play out that way. Assad did not poison gas his own people. I'm not saying it was a great regime. Undoubtedly, was guilty of atrocities, was corrupt and brutal. But the main brutality came from the U.S., Turkey, and Saudi-backed Islamists. Okay, so in 2018, there was the Astana agreements, which were not really a treaty, but kind of diffused the war. It continued. The jihadis agreed to go to Idlib. They were kind of supported by Turkey, still massively subsidized by Turkey. They remained there for a while. Then the U.S. remained in Syria, pivoted, and people thought Trump wanted to get out of Syria. So people, Trump's abandoning the Kurds. So, and the military basically wouldn't allow Trump to get out of Syria. So what he did is he pivoted. He pivoted the troops in Syria, relocated them, and they're in the north, occupies like a third of Syria, geographically a third of the area. They're geographically a third of Syria, and denying them their oil revenue for reconstruction, prime agricultural land. Okay, then in, I forget what year it was, 2020 something, there were the Caesar sanctions. Maybe a little bit earlier, 2018, 2019, the Caesar sanctions. They were ostensibly named after a guy who documented atrocities by Assad, and they were brutally punishing sanctions. Syria could do no trade with anyone. There were secondary and tertiary sanctions, sanction anyone who traded with anyone who traded with Syria is insane, choked off and destroyed the Syrian economy. Did far more damage than the Assad government ever did. And so Syria was already devastated by war. By the population of Syria is 11 million. There's like 4 million refugees, 1 million in Turkey. millions of refugees in Europe, created a political crisis in Europe, especially Germany and other places. A large countries had trouble absorbing refugees, and there was political crisis and big anti-immigrant sentiment in Germany and France. Okay, so that was the situation from like 2018 till now. The majority of Syria population were kept in extreme poverty. The Syrian currency collapsed, and they were in a horrible, horrific devastated situation. And okay, so Assad remained in power. He won the war, but lost the peace. There were the Astana agreements, which wasn't really a treaty, but there were some stability between Turkey, Russia, China, and the U.S. was actually not part of this. U.S. was partly frozen out. Okay, so so during from like 2018 onward, Putin, Russia actually offered to train the Syrian army, regroup and redevelop the Syrian army. Assad refused under the grounds that it would be, alienate some of his supporters. There was a lot of corruption. By then, he was reluctant to crack down on it. He didn't really want to. He refused. Russia wanted to more professionalize the Syrian army. And these were people who had been heroes. They fought bitterly in the 7-year war, 7-year civil war, and Assad didn't want to alienate these people. A little bit later, Iran offered to build air bases and bases to protect Syria, and Assad kind of turned that down as well. He didn't want Syria to become a permanent base of Iran. It's a primarily Sunni society. He didn't want to alienate people, and he actually was looking for a way out. He was looking for a way out. He tried to get closer to the Gulf states, same kind of states which were trying to overthrow him. Syria was readmitted to the Arab League. He tried to get closer to the Arab states. He was looking maybe get closer to Israel and the U.S. He's looking for a way out, and he couldn't find it. So things got worse and worse. What happened is, of course, Group HTS, which is basically regroup Al Qaeda. Essentially, Jelani, the leader, was the number 2 guy in ISIS. They had several leadership of Al Nusra, kind of had some sort of regroupment. They're the same people. They regrouped and changed their name several times. But this group, they're Turkish proxies. I think, starting in December 8th or so, they seized part of a highway outside Aleppo. And this was supposed to be just a warning, like Erdogan was trying to warn Assad or pressure him. And unexpectedly, they didn't find any resistance. And they got closer and closer, and the Syrian army put up no resistance. They backed away, kept backing away, and then they took Aleppo. Everyone was shocked. Well, the people thought, more pro-Assad people thought, well, it's a regroupment. They're not giving up, they're just regrouping. And then they got to Homs, which is like a key city in northern central Syria. Same thing happened. They surrendered almost without firing a fight. Apparently, orders from the top command was don't fire, don't fight back, and they didn't. There were people who wanted to fight in the Syrian army who really wanted to fight back. They were ordered not to. People didn't know what was going on. And then once they took Homs, HTS took Homs. It was kind of all over for the Syrian government. Homs is like the gateway to every place else, and it was all over. They took Damascus. Now Assad left. Now, he went to Moscow. There's a story this plane crashed, which turned out was a diversion. He and his family went to Moscow. He had supposedly issued some announcement afterwards, basically that the Russians made him leave. People said he should have made a final stand or something. He would, of course, ended up like Gaddafi, being anally raped or dragged in the street, something horrible like that. So he was, and the Syrian state collapsed. That was it. And shocked. No one knew this would happen. Nobody knows exactly what people bought out. Yeah, undoubtedly some of the top commanders were bought out, like Mohammed Morandi and many other people say top Syrian generals were paid like $40 a month. Well, HTS commanders were paid between $2,000 and $3,000 a month. In that situation, it's pretty easy to buy people out. Mohammed Randi says that Syrian intelligence had been bought out pretty early. They actually gave some of their positions away to the Israelis. They were bought out pretty early on. There's massive corruption. There was massive drug trade with Lebanon and elsewhere. It was, in a situation like that, is endemic corruption. It's the only way people have. Captagon was this drug. It was like it's an amphetamine, and often kept people from starvation. Selling it kept people from starvation. Literally, Syrian girl actually said, "Thank God for Keptagon." She was being kind of provocative, but that was like the only thing keeping people alive. Essentially, it was a horrific situation, and no society can withstand that. No society can withstand that for any length of time. So the Syrian state collapsed. Not just the Assad government collapsed, but the state collapsed. Israel's now bombing and has destroyed any military defense capability Syrian state might ever have. It's completely gone. Syria has no way whatsoever to defend itself. It's completely at the mercy of Israel and Turkey. They have no independence whatsoever. Turkey and Israel can do anything they want, and they are. Israel has occupied next to Golan Heights. They've occupied 3 times the area of the Golan Heights. Laith Maroof says we're going to see a ethnic cleansing bigger than the Nakba. I hope he's wrong, but it's horrible. He said 200,000 Christians have been expelled. The Christians, Alawites, and former Ba'athist officials and members are terrified right now. I don't know how it's going to play out. My hunch will be like the Lebanese Civil War. Some of these Alawites are forming their own militias. They are terrified. Jelani's trying to act moderate. So many, like the Facebook left and so many Trotskyist groups are saying, is this now the Syria dictator, the Assad dictatorship is gone, and will the left rise up? Will this provide an opportunity for the no? I mean, HTS and these groups don't care about exploiting surplus value from the working class. If people go on strike, they'll just be mad. They'll just kill them all. And they'll bring in slave labor. They don't really care. They want to set up another Saudi Arabia. I don't see there's no independent Syrian state. I don't see what the working class or the left has for leverage. They may have meetings, and I don't really know. I mean, I could be wrong. I don't really know. Syria was an important channeling for weapons to Hezbollah. They were somewhat of a liability, like Iran was selling them subsidized oil. That's cut off now. And they were part of the Axis services, but something of a liability. So I don't think people should celebrate the fall of Assad. I don't support the Assad government. For everything I said, I don't think people should celebrate either. Anyway, this video was a little longer than I intended, and I'm afraid I came off a little disjointed at times. I hope you enjoy it. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.